Hello all, Victoria Mariupolskaya is here. I'm gonna read the speech made by Maria Zakharova, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, that she made on April 19, 2018. It's very long, so I'm gonna do it in parts. This is part one. Uh, and it's called Political Crimes Committed by the UK. I think it's brilliant, and I think she spoke from her heart, and it's absolute truth. And this is something that British government is hiding from its own nation, and it's something hidden from the American people as well. So I'm creating this video to make it available to all. You can find this the text of speech on the internet, although there's no vocal translation of it. I didn't find a vocal translation of it on the internet, so I'm going to voice it for you. So here it comes. And now I'm asking everyone to fasten their belts. During a briefing on the OPCW, Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons report, held for the international diplomatic community on April 13, UK ambassador to Russia, Laurie Bristow, said that the Russian state has a record of state-sponsored assassinations, including in the UK. It is not the first Russophobic statement made by a UK official, or for that matter, not the first UK statement that is an offense to law, standards of decency, or any morals. But it's not the main point. Let's put aside morals and the law and talk about something different. Maybe the UK ambassador does not know his own country's history, role, and involvement in processes that took place in other countries over the past centuries. I don't think Mr. Bristow is to blame for absence of law in the UK. He probably just doesn't know his country's history. British Indian novelist Salman Rushdie wrote that the quote trouble with the new Englishness is that their history happened overseas, so they don't know what it means, unquote. And so the island status that motivated Britain's imperial story in the first place has helped them distance themselves from all aspects of that story. I think now is the time to fill the cognitive vacuum and tell the world something about Britain's history and its international activities and their consequences. Let us talk about state contracts, assassinations, and Britain's reputation. Let's start with modern history. It is not a common subject, but Britain was one of the most ruthless uh, metropolis in terms uh, of the respective action it took in its colonies and dependent territories. On November 22, 2017, British journalist and writer Afua Hirsch wrote in The Guardian that, quote, from the Norman conquest of Ireland in the 12th century, the English began imagining themselves as the new Romans, persuading themselves they were as duty bound to civilize backward tribes as they were destined to exploit their resources, land, and labor, unquote. The British see, quote, Britain's empire as a great moral achievement and its collapse as an act of casual generosity, unquote. This accepted view of Britain's history completely overshadows some inconvenient facts. If the motive is what matters most of all, nobody wants to know the details. But today we will be speaking about details. The establishment of concentration camps in the Boer War that later inspired the Nazis' death camps, the cultural annihilation of kingdoms and palaces from Ashanti to Beijing, British Army massacres in Ireland, and the devastation of Bengal. The industrial scale exploitation of natural resources, and the slave trade. These are only the most glaring facts. The impact of colonial rule of India was extremely devastating. In 1930, American historian Will Durant published a book about the history and life in India, The Case for India. His study of India brought him to the following conclusion. Quote, the more I read, the more I was filled with astonishing and with I'm sorry. The more I read, the more I was filled with astonishment and indignation at the apparently conscious and deliberate bleeding of India by England throughout 150 years. I began to feel that I had come upon the greatest crime in all history. Unquote. Britain has left fault lines across the globe, which is most acutely felt in the South Asian subcontinent, where a single nation was forcibly split into two in 1947. Today, each of these parts is overcoming the consequences of the British colonial legacy on its own. Member of Parliament, former UN Under Secretary General Shashi Tharoor, an astute statesman who once ran for UN Secretary General and deservedly enjoys respect the world over, has repeatedly stated that the British authorities suffer from historical amnesia as regards their imperial atrocities. One has to agree. Speaking at Oxford on July 22, 2015, he said, India's share of the world economy when Britain arrived at its shores was 23%. By the time the British left, it was down to below 4%. Why? Simply because India had been governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. Unquote. According to Dr. Tharoor, in fact, Britain's Industrial Revolution was actually premised upon the deindustrialization of India. Britain repeatedly provoked famine in India, which killed between 15 million and 29 million people. The best known famine was that in Bengal in 1943, when 4 million Indians died. You can think this to be just journalistic speculations, but no. Addressing Speaker's Research Initiative on July 24, 2015, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi stressed that the discourse of Dr. Shashi Tharoor met the aspirations of his country's citizens. I'm saying this to you, Mr. Bristow. In his book, Inglorious Empire, released in 2017, Dr. Tharoor cited the atrocities of the British Empire, stating that the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill should be regarded as one of the cruelest dictators of the 20th century. This is what Churchill said in a conversation with Secretary of State for India and Burma, Leopold Amery. Quote, I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits, unquote. This is not what we are saying, nor are these our inventions. It's a fact. The Russian artist Vasily Vereshchagin has a famous picture, the Devil's Mind. The Devil's Wind. This is not a symbolic comparison. The canvas shows a type of execution invented by the British to crush the 19th century sepoy immunity in India. A victim was tied to a gun with his back to the muzzle and blown to pieces by a gunshot. This was one of the most barbaric punishments in the history of civilizations, aimed not so much at physical extermination or intimidation. Even without it, the British had so many infernal instruments of torture and execution that this option doesn't seem so original and honestly was rather costly for the Brits. But from the religious and cost point of view, this method of putting to death is absolutely unacceptable for Indians. Their bodies were blown to pieces and the dead were buried together regardless of cost, which is radically at variance with the Indian tradition. Yet another episode of the same kind occurred in Amritsar, Punjab, on April 13, 1919, when 50 British troops under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer fired their rifles without warning at pilgrims celebrating Baishakhi, the Punjabi harvest and New Year festival, at the centrally located Jallianwala Bagh public garden. The gathering was mostly made up of women and children. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that these British subjects were acting on direct orders of the British authorities. According to the British government, 379 people were killed and over 1,000 wounded. The Indian National Congress said 1,000 people were killed and 1,500 wounded. Regrettably, millions of Indians were to fall victims to the acts committed by the British authorities, including mass executions by a firing squad during the least several decades after these sad events. Africa has also suffered its share of British abuse. Some 13 million Africans have been removed from the continent as slaves. This has to do with Britain's reputation and the UK ambassador's allegations regarding Russia. The number of Africans who died in that period is 3 or 4 times larger than the number of those who were removed from the continent. In other words, the overall number of victims runs into tens of millions of people. It is notable that English philosopher John Locke, who advanced the theory of civil society and whose works influenced those who wrote the US Constitution, was a major investor in Britain's slave trade. It is a fact. The British were among the first to invent concentration camps for civilians in the Boer War of 1899-1902. These camps were created for the civilians who were suspected of emphasizing with the rebels or who could help them. The British tortured their farms and fields and slaughtered their cattle. Women and children were separated from men. All this happened long before World War II. The men were taken to outlying regions or Britain's other colonies, such as India or Ceylon. When the world learned about this horrible invention of British military commander Lord Kitchener, the British government published an official statement saying that the camps had been created to keep the peaceful population of the Boer Republic safe from harm's way, and the camps were renamed refugee camps. This is remindful of the story of the White Helmets. Take militants, extremists, and terrorists, put white helmets on them with peace written on these helmets, and then use them to stage provocations and present mobile phone footage on their crimes as evidence of the plight of the civilians who must be saved. Centuries have passed, yet nothing has changed. Prisoners are now called guests of the crown. Overall, 200,000 people, or half of the white Boer population, was herded into the British camps, where about 30,000 of them died from disease and hunger. They were British camps in Cyprus, and in Palestine between the late 1930s and 1948, where Jewish refugees were sent and many of them were executed. Another dark page from Britain's history concerns the notorious Special Air Service of the British Army, which have been used in over 30 local conflicts, mostly former British colonies, including Kenya and several African countries, and several South African countries. In particular, about 50 former SAS servicemen were included in the Rhodesian regiment that was to play a key role in the coup staged during the transfer of power to the indigenous population of Rhodesia, renamed Zimbabwe. Historians believe that Britain is the world's leader when it comes to genocide, given the millions of innocent civilians that have been killed in British colonies. According to different estimates, between 90 and 95% of Aborigines were exterminated during the colonization of Australia. Indigenous Australians were not only killed but also used for experiments. The British deliberately infected them with various diseases, primarily pox. The aimed conflict between the British colonizers and the indigenous people of Tasmania, known as the Black War, all but exterminated Tasmanians in the early 19th century. Some British historians consider the war to have been a genocide. The British colonizers had official license to kill Tasmanians, with a bounty put on every person killed. That's talking about an international reputation. They were poisoned, driven out into the desert. where they died from hunger and thirst. They were hunted like wild animals. By 1835, about 200 of them survived. They were simply moved to neighboring islands. In the 1870s, on the orders of the British authorities, a genocide of Zulus was perpetrated in the Cape Colony, and in 1954 through 1961, of the Kikuyu people in Kenya. In retaliation for the killing of 32 white settlers by the local rebels, the British authorities massacred 300,000 Kikuyus and sent 1.5 million to work camps. An account of these events is given in the book by Carolyn Elkins titled The Untold Story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya. The Western media are reluctant and embarrassed to talk about it, but the personal story of the former US President Barack Obama speaks volumes. We have read that his father was tortured by the British during the Kenya rebellion. Or is that story untrue? Uh, remembering the notorious Opium Wars would not come amiss. London was poisoning Chinese people with drugs for decades. Britain organized a supply of uh, opium to China, making fabulous profits. The operation also pursued the military strategic aim of demoralizing the Chinese army and people and depriving them of the will to resist. In a bid to save his country, that the Chinese emperor in 1839 launched a massive operation to confiscate and destroy opium stocks in Canton. London retaliated by unleashing the Opium Wars. China was defeated and had to sign a crippling peace with Britain. As long as China remains a nation of opium smokers, there's not the least reason to fear that she will become a military power of any importance. As I'm quoting, and the habit, as the habit saps the energies and vitality of the nation. End of quote. Um, This was how Richard Hurst, the British consul in China, ended his speech to the Royal Opium Commission in 1895. It was not until 1905 that the Chinese authorities managed to adopt and start implementing a program to gradually ban opium. And now, for instance, from recent history, when London was already vocal in upholding human rights, calling itself a bastion of democracy and freedom. We have already described the suffering inflicted on India. This is not our question, this is common sense. Think of the suffering inflicted by the British authorities in the Middle East. One needs hardly go to any length to argue that Britain, seeking to retain as much influence as possible in the region as it saw the colonial system crumble, made some moves which created a deep rift between the Arabs and the Jews. One need not go into historical details. It is enough to open the world map and look at the borders in the region as they were redrawn by the British after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Nobody thought about borders as something more than lines drawn with a ruler, but it concerned the lives of those nations. As a result, tribes, ethnic and religious communities, and people were divided. The world is still reaping the fruit of that policy in the Middle East today, yet Britain is still very active on this issue. One more interesting fact: according to the British National Archives, declassified in 2014, the British authorities made wide use of chemical weapons to put down the Arab rebellion in Mesopotamia, present day Iraq, in the spring of 1920. Winston Churchill, as Britain's Secretary of State for War, supported, I quote, the use of gas against uncivilized tribes. End of quote. According to archives, Churchill ordered the use of thousands of mustard gas shells against the rebels. The anti-British rebellion in Iraq claimed between 6,000 and 10,000 lives, according to various sources, a negligible number from London's point of view compared to other regions. The Greeks, too, got their share of British brutality. In the spring of 1944, Britain crushed a revolt in the Greek army in Egypt. Many historians believe that the suppression of that revolt paved the way to and was a prelude to the British invasion of Greece in December 1944 and the Civil War of 1946, 1949. Of the 30,000 Greek officers and men in the Middle East, between 20,000 and 22,000 were imprisoned in British camps in Eritrea, Egypt, Sudan, and Libya. This goes on, but I'm going to stop for now. This is the end of part 1. See you next time when I'll read to you the rest of it. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.